I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is episode 24 of my series on the JFK assassination. In discussing the war that was taking place between President Kennedy and the national security establishment, it's necessary, of course, to talk about Southeast Asia. The Pentagon and the CIA were convinced that the communists were bent on taking control of Southeast Asia as part of the supposed worldwide communist conspiracy to take over the United States and the rest of the world, a conspiracy that was supposedly based in Moscow. Now, the communists were trying to take control over Laos, and the CIA and the Pentagon were pressuring President Kennedy to send troops into Laos. Well, the last thing that Kennedy wanted was to embroil the United States in a land war in Asia, and he had seen what had happened to the French over in Vietnam. So he resisted this pressure, and he ended up entering into an agreement with the Soviet Union to have a coalition government in Laos that included communists. And of course, this made Kennedy even more suspect in the eyes of the national security establishment, because remember, in their eyes, this was a war to the finish, and that you could not give an inch on the communists. So they totally disapproved of what Kennedy had done to resolve the crisis in Laos. Well, Kennedy ends up essentially succumbing to the pressure to send troops into Vietnam. Remember, at this point, Kennedy, as I indicated earlier, was still pretty much a standard Cold Warrior. He had bought into this notion that the communists were coming to get us. So he ends up sending troops, thousands of troops into Vietnam, but he makes clear with them that they are not to engage in combat. Again, that's the last thing he wanted, was to embroil the United States into a war in Vietnam. And so he limited the soldiers to an advisory capacity. I think they reached somewhere in the neighborhood of 14,000 troops. All right, now we jump ahead to where we left off in the last episode, where after the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy achieves this monumental breakthrough. He comes to the realization that this whole Cold War mindset is a bunch of bull. And ironically, Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, reached the exact same conclusion. Why'd they do that? Well, they both realized they had come within an inch of all-out nuclear war. If Kennedy had succumbed to the pressure that the military and the CIA were putting on him to attack Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, drop bombs, invade, there is virtually no doubt that there would have been an all-out nuclear war between the two powers, and most of us would not even be living today, and if we were, we'd still be living under the radiation from that all-out nuclear war. Both men realized the horrific consequences of what happened and how close they came to doing that. And they both realized this is not worth it. And so they both began this remarkable joint approach toward peace. Now, this is not something you're going to read about in your public school textbooks or even in your mainstream newspapers. This is something that the national security establishment has never wanted the American people to know. That there was this breakthrough by Kennedy as well as by Khrushchev, and then the monumental war that took place as a result of it. It was really a war over the future direction of America. It was a conflict of visions that were absolutely opposite to one another. And Kennedy throws the gauntlet down on June 10th, 1963, 5 months or so, 6 months before he was assassinated. And he gives a speech at American University that is one of the most remarkable speeches in presidential history. I mean, I highly recommend it. You can watch it and you can read it. It's called the Peace Speech, and you can just Google a Peace Speech, American University. In the speech, Kennedy just throws the gauntlet down, and he just says, the Cold War has come to an end. It's over, and we're going to peacefully coexist with the Soviet Union. Yes, we realize that they have a different philosophy, but keep in mind that we were partners in World War II, and if we could work together there, we can work together now, despite our differences philosophically, politically, economically. And so he said, we can even work together. Well, and he even sort of threw a slap in the face at one of the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Curtis LeMay. Remember, he's the guy that called the Cuban Missile Crisis the biggest defeat in U.S. history, where Kennedy says, we don't want a Pax Americana, this international peace through American force of arms. Well, that was a phrase that LeMay had used favorably in one of his addresses. And now the thing about this speech is that Kennedy didn't consult with the military. He didn't consult with the CIA. He didn't tell him what he was going to do. He just did it. And he essentially said, this thing's over. Now, from the standpoint of the U.S. military establishment, this was a dramatic change. Now, there had been this war going on between Kennedy and the national security establishment over how to deal with the so-called communist threat. But here Kennedy had achieved a breakthrough that wasn't arguing over how the Cold War should be managed or how the crisis should be managed. He was saying, no more Cold War. Now remember that the reason that the United States, the federal government, was converted to a national security state after World War II was because of this Cold War that they were getting ready to wage against their old World War II partner and ally, the Soviet Union. In fact, when Truman was thinking about doing this monumental revolutionary conversion of the federal government from a limited government republic to a national security state, somebody said, well, in order to do this, you're going to have to scare hell out of the American people, because they understood that fear was necessary for this thing. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if you're going to end the Cold War, what do you need the national security state anymore for? Remember, that was the justification for the conversion. And this was close enough in time where people still had lived under a limited government republic. So they would have naturally been thinking, well, if we don't have a Cold War anymore, why do we need this big standing military force? Why do we need the CIA? Why do we need the NSA? So Kennedy was not only threatening the vision of these people, he was threatening the very existence of their institution. But most important, the way they perceived Kennedy's move was surrender. I mean, this was it. Kennedy obviously, in their eyes, didn't understand the magnitude of this threat. That you cannot peacefully coexist with communists. That was their mindset. That this is a war to the finish, and that what Kennedy was essentially doing through this policy was going to be resulting in disarmament, surrender, and defeat to the communists. Now, Kennedy goes one step further. The next night, he delivers a national TV address defending Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. Well, this was the other gauntlet he was throwing down, because the national security establishment, including the FBI, which had essentially become a part of the national security establishment in many respects, they were convinced that Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement were communists. In fact, they believed that the Civil Rights Movement was the tip of the spear of the communist movement that was coming to take over the world and take over the United States. That the purpose of the Civil Rights Movement was to create chaos and strife and crisis, just to make things ready for when the communists came in and took over the federal government. So here's Kennedy saying, well, we need to respect the rights of this movement, and we need to protect the rights of this movement, which is essentially saying we need to protect the rights of these communists who are coming over to take over America. So he's ending the Cold War, and he's defending the tip of the spear of the so-called communist movement. Then he goes another step further, and he proposes a nuclear test ban treaty. Now, what this treaty would do was stop nuclear testing in the atmosphere. Just open air nuclear testing, which is what the Pentagon was doing in the CIA. They were blowing up nuclear bombs and just into the atmosphere. It's really no different from what they're complaining about North Korea having been doing. Remember, North Korea was blowing up nuclear bombs on top of the ground, and U.S. officials got all upset about it. Well, this is what the U.S. was doing at the time. Exact same thing. And Kennedy proposes to stop it. And the Pentagon and the CIA, they're saying, well, how can we win a nuclear war? How can we fight a nuclear war if we're not testing our weapons? And they oppose this idea. And so did Congress. Remember, Kennedy is now far ahead of the curve here, and he's far ahead of the American people with this breakthrough, this insight that the Cold War is a bunch of bull. And so what Kennedy does, he starts traveling around the country. He didn't try to lobby Congress, or at least he didn't try very hard. What his strategy was to change the mind of Congress in favor of this treaty was to go out and convince Americans. And then Americans would convince the chameleons in the Congress to change their position, because as we all know, when the change of the color takes place in public opinion, that's when the chameleons in Congress changed their positions too. And Kennedy understood that. So he went out and started giving a series of speeches in support of this, and he convinced Americans that it was a good thing to stop these tests. And so they pressured Congress, and then the chameleons in Congress changed their position, and Kennedy got the nuclear test ban treaty. But in the eyes of the national security establishment, Kennedy is disarming America. So he's ending the Cold War, he's protecting this communist sphere in the civil rights movement, and now he's disarming America. Then he issues an order to start withdrawing troops out of Vietnam. And he begins with 1,000 troops out of the 14,000 or so. Now remember, all these were advisors. They were told not to engage in combat, and there was very few casualties because of that reason. Kennedy's position was, look, this is their war. We will help them, advise them, train them, or whatever, but we will not fight this war for them. And by the time he reaches the breakthrough, though, he says, you know what? The U.S. has no role in this at all. But he recognized as a politician that he was very far ahead of the American people here in this insight. So he just orders them to pull out 1,000 troops. But he tells aides that as soon as he wins the presidential election in '64, he's going to pull the rest of them out. So this is the scene that is confronting the national security establishment. They were absolutely livid. And from their standpoint, they are now faced with the worst decision, worst choice in their lives. Because now they're convinced that this man, who they were convinced was a philanderer, playing around with women, by all, as far as they were concerned, he may have been being blackmailed. He was having an affair, for example, with a mafia don's girlfriend. Who's to know that someone wasn't blackmailing him into disarming America and essentially surrendering America to the communists. But in any event, when you add it all up, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs, the Operation Northwoods rejection, and so forth, Kennedy was perceived as weak, cowardly, and worst of all, a traitor. Now, if you go to Google Dallas Morning News advertisement, JFK, November 22nd, '63, you'll see this advertisement in the Dallas Morning News where it calls Kennedy a traitor and soft on communism. It is a vicious advertisement. And then do the same thing on the word flyer on that same day, because the right wing was passing out a flyer that said the same thing, that this is a traitor. Now, and soft on communism. Now, we all know what happens to traitors. Now, I'm not saying that the military, the CIA funded those two things, the flyer or the ad. What I'm saying is that the ad and the flyer reflected the mindset of the national security establishment. Now, Kennedy was well aware of the dangers he faced. He knew he was confronting the most powerful part of the federal government. He knew what the pressure was, and he knew what the dangers were, well aware of them. For one thing, he had listened to President Eisenhower, his predecessor, deliver his farewell address, where Eisenhower told the American people, look, there's no question we've got a new way of life here. With he called it the military-industrial complex, but he was talking about the national security establishment, the deep state, whatever label you want to put on this gigantic, permanent, ever-growing military establishment, secretive intelligence agency with the power to assassinate and detain people and torture people, and then an NSA with the power to spy on people, conduct secret surveillance, and so forth. These are all powers inherent to a totalitarian regime. These are exactly the types of things the Soviet Union was engaged in. So Eisenhower said in his farewell address, yeah, there's no question we've got this different way of life and this huge arms industry as well. Now, he was a standard Cold Warrior. He said, well, but this is necessary. He bought into that notion that it's necessary for the U.S. to adopt a totalitarian type structure in order to fight a totalitarian like structure like the Soviet Union. But he says we should never forget the dangers that are involved here, that this apparatus, this governmental apparatus, is a very, very severe threat to our freedoms, our liberties, and our democratic processes. That's Eisenhower talking. And Kennedy was there listening to that. Now, later, Kennedy read a book called 7 Days in May that posited this idea of a coup, a military coup in this country, because of what they perceived to be an incompetent president who was leading America to disaster. And Kennedy recognized the danger of this. And so he had friends in Hollywood make this novel into a movie. And the Pentagon was furious because Kennedy was using the White House, letting them use the White House for filming the movie. And it's a great movie with Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas. But it reflects how aware Kennedy was of the danger here of the national security establishment. And then if we jump ahead, for example, 10 years to the Chile's coup, it's very revealing. It reflects a lot of this mindset that you've got a situation where you've got a socialist president that's befriending the Soviet Union, just like Kennedy was, and for that matter, just as Arbenz was in Guatemala before they went in there for a regime change operation. And the Chilean military the military establishment, the military intelligence establishment, was very reluctant to get involved in a coup. The people of Chile had elected this socialist named Salvador Allende, and the U.S. said, no, this man has to go. He is a threat to U.S. national security, and he is a threat to your national security. And so the commanding general of the entire Chilean armed forces, a man named Rene Schneider, said, no, in this country we've got a constitution, and it doesn't provide for a coup as a means of removing the president. And the U.S. position was, national security is at stake, that your constitution is not a suicide pact. Your country is going down. And to this day, there are conservatives who support the coup on that basis, that if they hadn't done the coup, the country would have gone down to the communists. So the CIA orchestrates an assassination, kidnapping of Schneider. And it was technically a kidnapping, but there was no question that he was going to have to be assassinated. And because what else could they do with him? And so sure enough, he fights back during the kidnapping attempt, and he's killed. He's assassinated. And the CIA tried to cover up their role in this thing. They were paying off people and so forth. But it finally came out that the CIA had orchestrated the kidnapping that resulted in the assassination. And then the Chilean military was ready to do the coup, or as time was going on. But the Chilean military had to reach the mindset that when their own president is a threat to national security, a grave threat, that they have the duty to do this, even though the Constitution doesn't provide it. And that's the mindset that was facing the U.S. national security establishment, that they've got a president here that is a grave threat to national security by the policies he's adopting. And so now they're faced with the terribly uncomfortable task of deciding what to do. Should they let the country go down, or should they save the country by engaging in a regime change operation?